The worst roommate in America wasn't the guy who left dirty dishes in the sink. I told myself as I stood outside apartment 4B with two overstuffed duffel bags digging into my shoulders. It was the one who traded you to his brother for 3 months of housework. If someone had told me that sentence would become my life, I would have laughed and walked away. Instead, there I was, staring at a plain gray apartment door while my former roommate, Ryan Carter, waved cheerfully from the parking lot with the same guilty smile people wore after accidentally breaking your favorite coffee mug. "It's only 90 days, he shouted. "Mason's actually a great guy." Then he climbed into his truck and drove away before I could remind him that roommates were not baseball cards you could swap whenever it became convenient. My name is Ethan Brooks, and until that morning, I thought the biggest problem in my life was keeping up with graduate school while working 25 hours a week at a neighborhood bookstore. Apparently, I had underestimated Ryan's talent for making unbelievable decisions. According to the handwritten agreement he had somehow convinced me to sign during a late-night pizza discussion, I would move into his younger brother's apartment for exactly 3 months while Ryan completed a construction internship in another state. In return, Ryan would spend those same 3 months taking over every household chore in the apartment he shared with our mutual friends once he returned. At 2 in the morning, fueled by exhaustion and pepperoni, the arrangement had sounded ridiculous enough to be funny. Standing outside Mason Carter's apartment in broad daylight, it suddenly felt very real. Before I could knock twice, the door swung open. The man standing there looked nothing like Ryan. While Ryan always seemed relaxed, smiling, and slightly disorganized, Mason looked as though he scheduled his weekends 3 months in advance. He was tall, neatly dressed in a dark sweater despite the mild spring weather, and held a coffee mug perfectly centered in one hand. His blue eyes scanned my luggage before settling on my face with the expression of someone discovering an unexpected package on the front porch. "You're Ethan," he said flatly. "Unfortunately," I answered. "Come in," he replied without sounding particularly welcoming. The apartment was spotless. Not clean, spotless. The hardwood floors reflected sunlight like polished glass. Every book on the shelves matched perfectly in height. Even the throw pillows looked professionally arranged. I suddenly became painfully aware that one of my socks was sticking halfway out of my duffel bag. Mason closed the door behind me and pointed toward a framed sheet of paper hanging beside the kitchen. "Read the house rules." I blinked. "House rules? There are 20. I walked closer. Rule 1. Shoes stay by the entrance. Rule 2. Coffee mugs belong on coasters. Rule 3. Laundry is sorted by color immediately. Rule 4. Quiet hours begin at 10. Rule 5. Never enter the third bedroom. I stopped reading. "Wait," I said, turning toward him. "Why can't anyone go into the third bedroom?" Mason took another calm sip of coffee. "Because it stays closed." "That's not really an explanation. It's the only one you're getting." I looked back at the list, wondering if I had accidentally moved into a museum instead of an apartment. Ryan never mentioned any of this. Ryan also failed to mention you would arrive 43 minutes later than planned. I checked my phone. He was right. Exactly 43 minutes. Somehow, that made me even more nervous. Then, for the first time, I noticed something strange. Despite the immaculate apartment, despite the perfect order and impossible cleanliness, there wasn't a single family photograph anywhere. No vacation souvenirs. No framed memories. Just neat furniture and quiet walls that felt almost too quiet. Mason followed my gaze for half a second before setting his mug carefully onto a coaster without making the slightest sound. "You'll have the guest room," he said. 3 months. We stay out of each other's way. That will make this easier for both of us." I nodded, pretending that sounded simple. But something about the silence inside that apartment told me those 90 days were going to change far more than either of us expected. The next morning began at exactly 6:30 when the unmistakable aroma of freshly brewed coffee drifted beneath my bedroom door. I glanced at the clock, convinced it had to be an accident, but when I stepped into the hallway wearing yesterday's sweatshirt, I found Mason already dressed in a crisp button-down shirt, calmly preparing breakfast with the kind of precision usually reserved for laboratory experiments. Every movement seemed measured down to the second. Eggs cooked evenly, toast browned perfectly, fruit sliced into identical pieces that somehow looked too symmetrical to eat. He glanced at me only once before checking the timer on the coffee maker. "Good morning," I offered carefully. You are 12 minutes behind schedule, he replied. Schedule? Breakfast is at 6:45. I leave for work at 7:30. The kitchen is cleaned by 7:20. If you need the stove, use it before then. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline that never came. Instead, he placed a plate on the table with mathematical accuracy and sat down without another word. The silence stretched between us until I finally reached for the orange juice. Use the smaller glass, Mason said without looking up from his breakfast. The tall glasses are for weekends. My hand froze halfway across the counter. You have different glasses for weekdays? Yes. Why? Because routines reduce unnecessary decisions. I blinked twice before quietly switching to the smaller glass. Maybe Ryan had forgotten to mention that his younger brother was secretly a productivity expert. Or maybe Mason had simply built invisible walls around every part of his life. After breakfast, I tried to contribute by washing my own plate, but Mason gently stopped me before I could turn on the faucet. The dishwasher has an order. An order? Plates first. Bowls second. Cups last. You are joking. I never joke about the dishwasher. For a brief moment, I honestly could not tell if he was serious, and somehow that made the conversation even funnier. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing while he loaded each dish with astonishing care. By noon, I had unpacked most of my belongings, although finding places for them proved surprisingly difficult. Every cabinet already had labels. Every drawer served one specific purpose. When I placed a bag of trail mix beside the cereal boxes, Mason quietly moved it exactly 8 inches to the left. That shelf is for breakfast foods, he explained. Trail mix is a snack. It is oats and almonds. It is still a snack. I raised both hands in surrender. Your apartment. Your rules. For the first time since I arrived, I thought I saw the faintest hint of amusement in his expression, but it disappeared so quickly that I wondered if I had imagined it. Later that afternoon, while searching for an extra blanket, I accidentally walked toward the hallway leading to the third bedroom. I had barely reached the closed white door before Mason's voice stopped me. Please do not open that room. His tone remained calm, yet something beneath the words felt unexpectedly fragile. I turned back and noticed that the confidence he carried all day had slipped for only a heartbeat. His shoulders looked heavier somehow, and his eyes no longer seemed cold, only tired. I was just looking for a blanket, I said quietly. He nodded once and disappeared into a closet before returning with a neatly folded quilt. There are extra blankets here, he said. Thank you. Our fingers almost touched as he handed it to me, but he stepped back immediately, creating the same careful distance he always maintained. As evening settled outside the windows, the apartment became silent again. Mason sat alone in the living room reading a hardcover novel while soft jazz played through hidden speakers. Everything looked peaceful, almost perfect, yet I could not shake the strange feeling that every carefully organized shelf, every written rule, and every unopened door existed for the same reason. They were not there to control the apartment. They were there to keep something much deeper from falling apart. The first week settled into a rhythm that felt equal parts predictable and absurd. Every morning, Mason followed the exact same routine with almost supernatural consistency, while I seemed destined to disrupt it without even trying. On Monday, I left a paperback novel on the coffee table before heading to class. When I returned that evening, the book had been moved precisely to the center of the shelf beside the television. On Tuesday, I absent-mindedly placed my keys next to the fruit bowl. By dinner, they were resting inside a small ceramic tray labeled Daily Essentials near the entrance. Wednesday brought another quiet correction after I folded the living room blanket into what I considered a perfectly acceptable rectangle. Mason unfolded it without a word, folded it again into an impossibly neat square, and returned it to the arm of the couch as if demonstrating an ancient family tradition. By Thursday, I had started making a game out of predicting which harmless habit would bother him next. Tell me honestly, I said one evening while chopping vegetables for dinner. Did you organize your crayons by color when you were 5? Mason looked up from rinsing lettuce. No, I smiled triumphantly. See? Nobody is born this organized. He dried the lettuce carefully before answering. They were organized alphabetically by manufacturer. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the cutting board. For the first time since moving in, the corner of Mason's mouth lifted into an unmistakable smile. It lasted barely 2 seconds, but it completely changed his face. The stern expression that usually made him seem distant suddenly disappeared, revealing someone much younger than I had imagined. "There it is," I said, pointing at him dramatically. "You actually know how to smile." He immediately returned to washing vegetables. "Do not get used to it." Too late. From that day forward, our apartment felt just a little less quiet. We still spent most evenings doing our own work, but silence no longer felt uncomfortable. Sometimes I studied at the kitchen island, while Mason reviewed reports from his architecture firm across the table. Other nights we watched trivia shows without speaking much, occasionally competing over answers neither of us wanted to admit we enjoyed. It was surprisingly normal. One rainy Saturday morning, I found him standing by the living room window holding a watering can. He carefully watered 3 small houseplants, lined along the windowsill, speaking so softly that I almost thought I had imagined it. "You missed one," I said after noticing a tiny succulent tucked behind a stack of books. Mason blinked before quietly watering the forgotten plant. "Thank you. You remember 20 house rules, but you forget one cactus?" "Apparently." I grinned. "That makes you human after all." He shook his head with quiet resignation. "Please do not tell Ryan." "That depends." "On what?" "Whether breakfast tomorrow includes pancakes." He sighed in the exaggerated way only someone pretending to be annoyed could manage. "Blueberry. Now you are negotiating." "Chocolate chip. You drive a hard bargain." Early Sunday afternoon, Ryan called on video chat. His face appeared on the screen wearing the biggest self-satisfied grin I had ever seen. "So," he announced confidently, "how is life with my impossible little brother?" Before I could answer, Mason walked behind me carrying a basket of folded laundry. Ryan stared at the screen. "Wait, are you two making lunch together?" Mason answered without hesitation. "Ethan overcooks pasta." "Only because you measure spaghetti with a ruler," I protested. Ryan burst into laughter so loudly that he nearly dropped his phone. "This is incredible," he said between laughs. "You are already arguing like an old married couple." Both Mason and I answered at exactly the same time. "We are not arguing." We stopped, looked at each other, and then immediately looked away. Ryan's grin somehow became even wider. After the call ended, the apartment grew quiet once more, but it was a different kind of silence now. It felt warmer, lighter, almost comfortable. As I carried my empty coffee mug toward the sink, my eyes drifted once again to the closed white door at the end of the hallway. Every day, Mason seemed a little easier to understand, yet that single room remained untouched, locked away behind polite conversations and carefully arranged routines. For reasons I could not explain, I had begun to suspect that whatever waited behind that door was not something Mason wanted to hide from me. It was something he was still trying to hide from himself. Monday mornings always smelled like fresh coffee and toasted sourdough, and somehow that simple combination had become the unofficial beginning of our strange little routine. By the second week, I no longer needed an alarm because I could predict exactly when Mason would grind the coffee beans, when the kettle would whistle, and when soft piano music would quietly fill the apartment. It should have felt repetitive, but instead it gave the place an unexpected warmth. One chilly afternoon, heavy rain rolled across the city just as I finished my shift at the bookstore. I hurried home carrying a backpack full of textbooks, only to realize halfway up the apartment stairs that I had forgotten my umbrella at work. By the time I reached our floor, my clothes were soaked through and my shoes made embarrassing squeaking sounds across the hallway. Before I could even search for my keys, the apartment door opened. Mason stood there holding a clean towel. "You forgot your umbrella," he said calmly. I blinked. "How did you know?" "You never check the weather forecast." "That is a frighteningly accurate observation." He handed me the towel before disappearing toward the laundry room. I expected another lecture about wet floors, but instead he returned carrying a pair of thick cotton socks and placed them beside the couch. "The floor is cold," he explained simply. "You will be more comfortable." I looked at him for a long second. "You planned this." "I noticed the forecast this morning." "So you prepared dry socks before I even left?" Mason looked almost uncomfortable being questioned. It seemed practical. Practical. That was always his favorite word. Yet nothing about setting out warm socks for someone else felt practical. It felt thoughtful. That evening I noticed something else. While I showered, my damp jacket had quietly disappeared from the coat rack. When I walked into the laundry room, it was already washed, carefully dried, and hanging neatly beside the door. "You did not have to do that," I said. Mason continued folding towels without looking up. The washing machine was already running. Still, it took less than 5 minutes. I smiled to myself because I was beginning to understand his language. Mason rarely said kind things directly. Instead, kindness appeared in freshly folded blankets, repaired backpack straps, a phone charger left beside the couch after mine stopped working, or an extra sandwich packed whenever he noticed I skipped breakfast. None of those gestures came with explanations. They simply appeared, as dependable as sunrise. A few days later, I stayed up later than usual finishing a research paper. Around midnight, I wandered into the kitchen hoping to find something sweet. The refrigerator contained a small slice of blueberry pie sitting on a plate with a handwritten note that simply read, "Save room for breakfast." There was no signature because there did not need to be one. The handwriting was unmistakably Mason's. The next morning, I carried the empty plate to the sink. "The pie was good," I said casually. He nodded while measuring coffee grounds. The bakery had one slice left. "You remembered blueberries are my favorite." His hands paused for the briefest moment. "You mentioned it once." Once. During a conversation nearly 2 weeks earlier while we were shopping for groceries. I had completely forgotten saying it. He had not. Later that afternoon, we stopped by a neighborhood farmer's market after picking up a replacement light bulb for the apartment. We wandered between local vendors selling homemade jam, flowers, and fresh vegetables. At one booth, an elderly woman smiled warmly at us before placing 2 small samples of apple cider donuts onto a napkin. "You boys make a lovely couple," she said with complete confidence. My face immediately grew warm. "Oh, we are actually just roommates," I answered quickly. The woman laughed kindly. "That is exactly what my husband said the first time we met." Mason quietly thanked her, accepted the donuts, and continued walking beside me without correcting her. We ate in comfortable silence until I finally glanced sideways at him. "You could have said something." "She seemed happy," he replied. There was no reason to disappoint her. I laughed, shaking my head. But as we walked home carrying reusable grocery bags through the crisp afternoon air, I realized something had changed without either of us noticing. The apartment no longer felt like a temporary arrangement. It was beginning to feel like home, and somewhere between neatly folded blankets, shared breakfasts, and quiet acts of kindness, I had stopped counting how many days remained out of those 90. The answer arrived on an ordinary Wednesday, hidden inside the kind of moment most people would have forgotten before dinner. Mason had left for work earlier than usual after mentioning an unexpected client meeting, leaving the apartment unusually quiet. I spent the morning finishing assignments before deciding to surprise him by making dinner for once instead of letting him do all the cooking. It felt only fair after everything he had quietly done for me. While searching the pantry for pasta, I realized we had run out of olive oil. I remembered seeing an unopened bottle in the hallway storage closet a few days earlier, so I walked over and opened the door without giving it much thought. Inside, everything was arranged with Mason's familiar precision. Cleaning supplies occupied one shelf, extra light bulbs another, and neatly labeled storage bins filled the lower half of the closet. As I reached toward the bottle, a small cardboard box resting on the top shelf tipped forward and landed gently at my feet. The lid slipped open. Several old photographs slid across the hardwood floor. Instinctively, I knelt to gather them before they could bend. The first picture showed 2 young boys standing beside identical bicycles with huge smiles stretching across their faces. Ryan looked exactly as I remembered him from college, carefree and laughing, while a much younger Mason stood beside him with the same bright smile I had only seen once or twice since moving in. Another photograph showed the brothers decorating a Christmas tree with 2 older adults whose expressions radiated quiet happiness. Then I noticed the dates. Every photograph stopped nearly 8 years earlier. There was nothing newer. No graduations. No birthdays. No vacations. Nothing. Before I could wonder why, I heard the apartment door unlock. Mason stepped inside carrying his briefcase. The moment his eyes landed on the scattered photographs, he froze completely. Neither of us spoke. I immediately gathered the pictures into a careful stack and held them out. "I am sorry," I said quietly. The box fell when I reached for the olive oil. Mason accepted the photographs without the slightest trace of anger. Instead, he stared at them for a long moment before placing them back inside the box with extraordinary care. "Thank you," he said softly. His voice sounded different somehow, almost distant. I hesitated before asking, You look so happy in these. He closed the lid but did not put the box away. That was a long time ago. I waited, sensing he wanted to continue even if the words came slowly. Finally, he sat at the kitchen table, folded his hands together, and looked toward the window instead of at me. Our parents died within 11 months of each other, he said quietly. After that, Ryan tried to keep everything normal. I tried to control everything else. The sentence settled over the room with unexpected weight. Suddenly, the labeled cabinets, the written schedules, the perfectly folded blankets, even the 20 house rules made painful sense. They were never about perfection. They were about holding together a life that had once fallen apart. I thought. Mason continued after a long silence. If every small thing stayed where it belonged, maybe nothing important would disappear again. I did not know what to say. There was no clever joke capable of reaching that kind of loneliness. Instead, I poured 2 cups of coffee and quietly placed one beside him. We sat together without speaking for several minutes, watching rain drift across the apartment windows. Eventually, Mason gave a faint, almost embarrassed smile. Ryan worries too much. I looked at him curiously. He talks about you a lot? Mason nodded once. More than you would expect. Just then my phone buzzed. A message from Ryan appeared across the screen. I opened it, expecting another ridiculous joke, but instead I found only one sentence. I had hoped you would be the first person in years to remind my little brother that living is more important than organizing. I looked up from the screen toward Mason, who was quietly staring into his untouched coffee, completely unaware of what his brother had written, and for the first time I began to wonder if those 90 days had never really been about roommates or housework at all. After that conversation, something subtle shifted between us, not because either of us made a grand promise, but because the silence no longer felt like a wall. It became a place we could comfortably share. The following weekend arrived with bright blue skies and cool spring air, and for the first time since moving in, Mason suggested leaving the apartment without consulting a shopping list or running errands. There is a farmer's market by the river, he said while pouring coffee. They have fresh bread. I looked at him with exaggerated suspicion. You are inviting me somewhere voluntarily? He raised an eyebrow. Do not make me change my mind. Too late. I am already putting this in my memory forever. He shook his head, but I caught the smallest smile before he turned away. The market was busy with families, musicians, and food stands filling the sidewalks with laughter and the scent of cinnamon, roasted coffee, and fresh flowers. Mason moved through the crowd much more slowly than usual, stopping to admire handcrafted furniture and local artwork instead of hurrying toward the grocery vendors. I noticed he asked thoughtful questions wherever we stopped, listening carefully to every answer, even when he did not buy anything. At one booth, an elderly carpenter showed us a collection of hand-carved birdhouses. Mason examined each one with genuine curiosity before quietly purchasing the smallest model shaped like a tiny cottage. You have birds? I asked. No, he replied. But the balcony might. I laughed. That sounds strangely optimistic. Perhaps. It was such a simple word, yet hearing optimism from him felt almost miraculous. On the walk home, we passed a neighborhood park where dozens of children chased soccer balls across the grass while parents gathered beneath large oak trees. Mason slowed his pace, watching the families with a thoughtful expression. Ryan always wanted a house with a big backyard, he said unexpectedly. He used to say, children should always have room to run. And what did you want? I asked. He considered the question longer than I expected. I never really thought that far ahead. You should. Why? Because you deserve a future that is bigger than surviving the past. He looked at me for several quiet seconds before lowering his eyes with an expression I had never seen before. It was not sadness. It was uncertainty, as though nobody had ever suggested that possibility to him. Back at the apartment, we spent the afternoon assembling the little birdhouse together on the balcony. I held the instruction sheet, while Mason carefully tightened each tiny screw. You know, I teased, this is the first project where you cannot alphabetize the parts. Do not underestimate me, he answered with perfect seriousness. We both laughed. When the birdhouse was finally secured beside the railing, we stepped back to admire it. It was slightly crooked. I expected Mason to adjust it immediately, but instead he folded his arms and simply looked at it. You are leaving it like that? I asked in disbelief. It is close enough. I stared at him dramatically. Who are you? And what have you done with the real Mason? He chuckled quietly, the sound so natural that neither of us seemed surprised anymore. That evening we cooked dinner together, moving around the kitchen with an ease that no longer required careful instructions. I chopped vegetables while Mason stirred a pot of tomato soup, occasionally handing me ingredients before I even realized I needed them. We had somehow learned each other's rhythm. After dinner, I noticed the little birdhouse through the balcony window. A tiny sparrow had landed on its roof for only a few seconds before flying away again. "Look," I said softly. Mason joined me by the glass. Neither of us spoke as we watched the empty birdhouse swaying gently in the evening breeze. "It came faster than I expected," he whispered. "Sometimes," I replied, "all something needs is a place that feels safe enough to stop." Mason did not answer immediately, but I noticed his reflection in the window instead of the balcony outside. For just a brief moment, it looked as though he was no longer talking about the little wooden house at all. Time has a strange way of changing without asking permission. One morning I realized I no longer needed to check the calendar hanging beside the refrigerator because I already knew the answer I had been quietly avoiding. Nearly 2 months had passed. What once felt like a temporary arrangement had slowly become an ordinary life, and that ordinary life had become something I was not ready to lose. The realization arrived in the smallest possible way. While leaving for class, I instinctively reached for my travel mug before remembering I had left it in the bookstore the day before. Without saying a word, Mason opened the cabinet above the coffee maker, took down the spare insulated mug he had purchased weeks earlier, filled it with fresh coffee exactly the way I liked it, and handed it to me. "You forgot this one yesterday," he said. "I thought you might need another." I accepted the mug with a quiet smile. "You notice everything." He shrugged lightly. "Only the important things." The words lingered with me for the rest of the day. That evening, while organizing books behind the register at work, I caught myself wondering what Mason was cooking for dinner and whether he had remembered to water the balcony plants. It felt less like thinking about a roommate and more like thinking about someone waiting at home. That thought should have frightened me. Instead, it made me smile. When I returned to the apartment, the familiar scent of roasted garlic drifted through the hallway. Mason stood in the kitchen wearing the navy apron I had jokingly given him after discovering he owned 3 identical gray ones. He pretended to dislike the gift, yet somehow it had become his favorite. "You are late," he said without looking up from the stove. The bookstore received a shipment of new releases. "Did you eat?" I waited. I stopped in the doorway. "You could have started without me." He stirred the sauce quietly before answering. Food tastes better when someone else is at the table. I could not explain why that simple sentence settled so deeply inside me. During dinner we talked about everything and nothing, from architecture to mystery novels to whether blueberry pancakes were superior to chocolate chip. The conversation flowed so naturally that I almost forgot there had been a time when every sentence between us felt carefully measured. After we finished eating, I noticed a folded envelope resting beside the fruit bowl. My name was written across the front in Ryan's unmistakable handwriting. "It came today," Mason said. "I thought you should open it." Inside was a short letter and a printed schedule. Ryan's internship would end exactly 3 weeks later. He would be returning home on the following Saturday. 3 weeks. 90 days suddenly no longer felt like an abstract number. They had become a countdown. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope without saying anything. Mason quietly gathered the empty dishes and carried them to the sink. Neither of us mentioned the date again, but the apartment somehow felt different. The same walls, the same furniture, the same quiet music. Yet everything carried the faint weight of an ending. Over the following days we both pretended nothing had changed. We still shared breakfast every morning. We still stopped by the neighborhood bakery on Saturdays. We still laughed whenever I deliberately folded blankets the wrong way just to watch Mason silently fix them. But beneath every ordinary moment lived the same unspoken question. What happened after the 90 days were over? One rainy evening, I found Mason standing alone on the balcony watching the little birdhouse we had built together. A pair of sparrows had finally begun carrying tiny twigs inside. "Looks like they decided to stay," I said softly as I joined him. Mason nodded without taking his eyes off the birds. "They found a place that felt like home." The words were gentle, almost whispered, but there was a sadness behind them that had not been there before. I looked at the growing nest inside the little wooden house, then back at the apartment glowing warmly behind us. And for the first time since moving in, I realized that the deadline was not simply approaching. It was quietly breaking both of our hearts long before either of us was willing to admit it. The final Saturday arrived much faster than either of us expected. I woke before sunrise, not because of an alarm, but because the apartment felt different. The familiar sounds were still there. The coffee grinder hummed softly. The kettle whistled. Piano music drifted through the living room. Yet beneath those comforting routines rested an uneasy stillness that neither of us could ignore anymore. When I stepped into the kitchen, Mason had already prepared breakfast exactly the way he always did. 2 plates, 2 mugs, 2 neatly folded cloth napkins. The only difference was the cardboard boxes stacked quietly beside the hallway wall. I looked at them before forcing myself to sit down. "You packed already?" I asked. Mason poured coffee into my mug without meeting my eyes. "I thought it would make tomorrow easier." "Does it?" He paused for a moment. "No." That single word carried more honesty than anything he had said in weeks. We ate slowly, talking about ordinary things that neither of us truly heard. The weather forecast. A new bakery opening downtown. A documentary I wanted to watch. Every conversation carefully avoided the one subject filling the room. Later that afternoon, Ryan finally called. His cheerful voice filled the apartment through the speakerphone. "Good news," he announced. "The project finished early. I will be home tomorrow morning." I forced enthusiasm into my voice. "Congratulations." "Thanks." "Hey, Ethan, I cannot wait to hear all the stories." "Mason did not scare you away, did he?" I glanced toward Mason, who was quietly watering the balcony plants. "Not exactly." Ryan laughed. I knew it. Before I could ask what he meant, he continued speaking in a calmer voice. "Actually, there is something I should tell both of you." Mason slowly lowered the watering can and turned toward the phone. "Go ahead," he said. Ryan took a deep breath. The housework deal was never real. Silence filled the apartment. I looked at Mason. Mason looked at the floor. "What do you mean?" I finally asked. "I mean, I made the whole thing up," Ryan admitted. "I knew neither of you would ever agree to live together otherwise. Ethan, you always took care of everyone except yourself. Mason, you shut yourself away from everyone after Mom and Dad were gone. I kept thinking the two people I cared about most were both lonely in completely different ways. I could barely find the words. You planned this." "Every ridiculous part of it," Ryan answered with an embarrassed laugh. "The agreement, the 3 months, even pretending I desperately needed someone to trade apartments with. I figured if I gave you both a deadline, neither of you would feel trapped. You would simply have a chance." I slowly sat down at the kitchen table, trying to absorb everything he had said. Across the room, Mason remained perfectly still. Ryan's voice softened. "I know it was manipulative. You both have every right to be angry with me. But I hoped that maybe, just maybe, you would remind each other what home is supposed to feel like." No one spoke for several long seconds. Finally, Ryan cleared his throat. "I should let you process this. I will see you tomorrow." The call ended. The apartment became impossibly quiet. I stared at the dark phone screen while everything from the past 2 months replayed in my mind. The breakfasts, the grocery trips, the birdhouse, the laughter. None of it had been fake. The circumstances that brought us together had been invented, but every memory afterward belonged completely to us. I looked toward Mason. He was standing by the balcony door, watching the pair of sparrows disappear into the tiny wooden house we had built together. Without turning around, he spoke so softly I almost missed it. Maybe Ryan was right about one thing. "What is that?" I asked. Mason rested one hand against the balcony door and quietly answered. "Some people do not realize they have found home until someone tells them it is time to leave." The next morning arrived wrapped in golden sunlight, as if the city itself had decided to pretend nothing was changing. Ryan's truck pulled into the parking lot shortly after 9 o'clock, and for a long moment I simply watched through the living room window without moving. Mason stood beside me with his hands resting quietly in his pockets. Neither of us spoke. When Ryan stepped inside carrying a duffel bag over one shoulder, he looked from me to Mason and immediately stopped smiling. "You both look like somebody canceled Christmas," he joked gently, but the silence answered him before either of us could. He set his bag down and glanced around the apartment. Everything looked exactly the same as it had 3 months earlier, except for one detail. The little birdhouse on the balcony now held 2 tiny sparrows busily carrying food to a nest hidden inside. Ryan noticed it too. You built that together? He asked. Mason nodded once. Ryan smiled softly before turning back toward us. Well, he said, I guess I should start moving my things back in. The words landed harder than I expected. I looked toward the hallway where my packed boxes waited patiently beside the wall. They were ready. I was supposed to pick them up, thank Mason for everything, and return to the life I had before. Instead, every step toward those boxes felt strangely impossible. Ryan quietly disappeared into the guest room, giving us more privacy than either of us had requested. The apartment became silent once again. I picked up my backpack and rested it over one shoulder before taking a slow breath. Thank you, I said to Mason. For the breakfasts, the coffee, the birdhouse, the warm socks, the pie, everything. He looked down at the floor for several seconds before answering. You do not have to thank me. I do. I reached for the first cardboard box. Before I could lift it, Mason spoke my name. Ethan. His voice was calm, but there was an unfamiliar urgency beneath it. I turned around. He took one hesitant step forward, something I had never seen him do before. Leave the boxes. I blinked. What? Leave them here. He took another careful breath, searching for words that clearly did not come easily to him. 3 months ago, I believed routines were what made a house feel safe. Then you arrived and ignored half my rules, laughed at the other half, folded blankets incorrectly on purpose, and somehow made this apartment feel warmer than it has in years. I could not look away from him. Ryan gave us a deadline. Mason continued quietly, but he does not get to decide what happens. After it ends, a faint smile touched his face, nervous and completely genuine. Forget the agreement. Forget the 90 days. Stay because I want you here. For a heartbeat, the entire world seemed to disappear, leaving only the quiet apartment that had slowly become home for both of us. I laughed softly through the emotion gathering in my chest. You know, I said, for someone who organizes everything, that was a surprisingly unplanned speech. Mason let out a quiet laugh of his own. I noticed. I set my backpack back on the floor. Then I carried the first cardboard box away from the front door and placed it inside the guest room instead of the hallway. Behind us, Ryan leaned against the kitchen doorway with an expression that mixed relief and amusement. I was wondering how long it would take, he admitted. Mason looked toward his brother with a playful seriousness I had never seen before. You are still doing the housework. Ryan laughed. Fair enough. We all stepped onto the balcony together, just as the 2 little sparrows returned to the birdhouse carrying fresh twigs for their growing nest. Mason stood beside me, our shoulders almost touching, while the evening breeze carried the scent of spring through the air. I smiled as I watched the tiny birds disappear inside the little wooden house we had built together, realizing that home had never been about perfect routines or carefully written rules. Home was simply the place where someone quietly remembered your favorite coffee, saved the last slice of pie, waited to eat dinner until you came back, and finally found the courage to ask you to stay. Life did not suddenly become extraordinary after that morning. In fact, the most surprising part was how wonderfully ordinary everything remained. Ryan officially moved into an apartment only 3 blocks away, insisting that 2 brothers living under the same roof again would probably drive each other completely insane. Besides, he joked while carrying the last moving box downstairs, I have already played matchmaker once. I should retire while I still have a decent success rate. Mason rolled his eyes in the familiar way that no longer looked annoyed but affectionate. You are never allowed to organize my life again. Ryan grinned. That sounds exactly like something a happy man would say. The front door closed behind him, leaving the apartment unexpectedly quiet once more. I looked around the living room, half expecting the silence to feel lonely again, but it did not. It felt peaceful. My cardboard boxes were no longer stacked beside the hallway. Over the past week, they had quietly disappeared into closets, bookshelves, and drawers until every corner of the apartment held small reminders that this was now our shared home. My favorite novels rested beside Mason's architecture books. My sneakers sat beside his polished dress shoes near the entrance. Even the refrigerator had changed. Mason's carefully arranged containers now shared space with the blueberry yogurt I always bought and the spicy salsa he had recently admitted he secretly enjoyed after insisting for years that he disliked it. I still think you exaggerated, I teased while unpacking groceries one Saturday afternoon. You have eaten it 3 times this week." He pretended to study the nutrition label before answering. People are allowed to revise incorrect opinions. That might be the most dramatic personal growth story I have ever witnessed. He looked at me with the same quiet smile that had become increasingly common over the past several weeks. "You have influenced me in unexpected ways. Such as, I own colorful coffee mugs now." I laughed so hard that I nearly dropped the loaf of bread in my hands. It was true. The perfectly identical gray mugs had gradually been replaced by mismatched ones collected from local coffee shops during our weekend walks. One displayed a mountain landscape. Another carried a terrible joke about espresso. My favorite showed a sleepy raccoon holding an enormous cup of coffee. Mason claimed it was completely impractical. Somehow it always ended up being the mug he reached for first. One Sunday afternoon, we decided to reorganize the third bedroom together. For the first time since I had moved in, Mason unlocked the door without hesitation. The room was filled with neatly stored boxes containing old family photographs, holiday decorations, childhood keepsakes, and furniture covered with protective cloth. Sunlight drifted gently through the window as we carefully sorted everything into new shelves. We framed one photograph showing young Ryan and Mason beside their bicycles and placed it in the living room where everyone could see it. Mason stood quietly in front of the picture for several moments before taking a slow breath. "I think they would have liked this," he said softly. I knew exactly who he meant. "I think so too." He looked around the room that had once remained locked behind old memories and gave a small nod. "Maybe this does not need to be a storage room anymore. What should it become?" I asked. Mason thought for a moment before smiling. "Something we actually use. A reading room. A guest room. A place for future projects." None of those possibilities felt frightening anymore. They felt hopeful. That evening, we carried 2 comfortable chairs inside, placed a small bookshelf beneath the window, and watched the sunset paint warm shades of gold across the walls. When I stepped onto the balcony later that night, the little birdhouse stood exactly where we had built it months earlier. The sparrows had finished their nest, and quiet chirping drifted through the cool evening air. Mason joined me carrying 2 mugs of coffee. Without saying a word, he handed me the raccoon mug before leaning comfortably against the railing beside me. The apartment behind us was still tidy, but no longer perfect, and somehow it had never looked more beautiful. Some blankets were folded my way. Some shelves were arranged his way. Together, they told the story of 2 ordinary people who had slowly stopped changing the apartment to fit themselves and had instead changed themselves to make room for each other. Autumn arrived quietly, painting the trees outside our apartment in shades of amber and crimson that seemed to soften the entire neighborhood. Life continued moving forward in small, meaningful ways that no longer felt accidental. Saturday mornings became our favorite tradition. Mason always insisted on leaving the apartment at exactly 9 o'clock, while I always managed to delay us by searching for my keys at the last possible moment. "You misplaced them again," he said one morning with the familiar calm that no longer sounded like criticism. "I did not misplace them," I replied confidently. "I temporarily forgot their location." Without saying another word, he reached into the pocket of my jacket hanging by the front door and handed them to me. "Your temporary memory has improved," I admitted with a laugh. "I am beginning to suspect you secretly enjoy rescuing me." "Only on weekends," he answered, and the quiet smile that followed made the entire exchange feel warmer than the fresh coffee waiting in our travel mugs. We spent the afternoon wandering through a local street festival filled with musicians, handmade crafts, and food trucks lined along several downtown blocks. At one booth, an elderly artist painted personalized watercolor bookmarks. She looked up from her easel and smiled warmly. "Would you like one with your names together?" she asked. Months earlier, I probably would have rushed to explain our situation. This time I simply looked at Mason. He looked back at me with a gentle expression that held neither hesitation nor uncertainty. "Yes," he answered before I could speak. The artist carefully painted 2 small birds perched on the same branch beneath our names. When she handed us the finished bookmark, Mason slipped it into the novel I had been reading without making a grand gesture or dramatic speech. It became another one of those quiet acts that somehow meant everything. On our walk home, we stopped at the little bakery where the owner already knew our usual order before we reached the counter. "Blueberry muffin for you," she said, placing one into a paper bag before looking toward Mason. And cinnamon roll for the gentleman who pretends he comes here only for the coffee. I laughed as Mason accepted the pastry with playful resignation. Apparently my reputation has expanded. It has, I agreed. You are becoming dangerously predictable. Coming from the man who buys the same blueberry muffin every Saturday. I consider that a compliment. Back at the apartment, rain began falling softly against the windows, encouraging us to spend the rest of the afternoon indoors. The reading room we had created together quickly became our favorite corner of the apartment. Mason settled into one chair with an architecture magazine, while I curled into the other with my novel and the watercolor bookmark resting between the pages. Hours passed without either of us speaking very much. Every now and then one of us would quietly recommend an interesting article or read a funny sentence aloud, but most of the afternoon unfolded in peaceful silence. It was the kind of silence that no longer carried loneliness. It carried trust. As evening approached, I noticed Mason quietly studying the framed family photograph we had placed on the bookshelf several weeks earlier. You were thinking about them again? I said gently. He nodded before looking toward me. For a long time, I believed moving forward meant leaving the past behind. He paused, his eyes returning to the smiling faces in the picture. Now I think it means carrying the best parts of it with you while still making room for something new. I walked over and stood beside him, looking at the photograph with him instead of trying to find the perfect words. Outside, the little birdhouse swayed gently in the autumn breeze while the sparrows disappeared inside their nest for the evening. Mason reached for my hand without ceremony, as naturally as someone reaching for home after a long day. And together we watched the last golden light settle across the balcony, both quietly understanding that the happiest chapters of our story had not been found by chasing extraordinary moments, but by learning to treasure ordinary ones together. Winter arrived with crisp mornings and clear blue skies that made the city seem quieter than usual. The little birdhouse on our balcony now wore a light dusting of frost each dawn, yet the sparrows never abandoned it. Every morning they emerged together, circled the apartment building once, and disappeared into the bright sky before returning again each evening. Mason claimed they were simply following instinct. I like to believe they were reminding us that home was always worth coming back to. Our own routines had continued changing in ways neither of us could have predicted months earlier. The handwritten list of 20 house rules still hung beside the kitchen, but it looked different now. Rule 7 had a tiny coffee stain beside it because I had accidentally splashed it while laughing one morning. Rule 12 had a smiley face drawn beside it after Ryan visited and declared that every official document deserved at least one unnecessary doodle. Even Rule 5, the one about never entering the third bedroom, had quietly disappeared. In its place, a new line written in Mason's careful handwriting simply read, "Leave the room better than you found it." I stood in front of the list one evening and smiled. You changed the rules. Mason looked up from the dining table where he was reviewing blueprints. Some rules no longer made sense. You would have argued with yourself 3 months ago. Probably. He closed the folder and walked over beside me. People are allowed to grow. I nudged his shoulder playfully. I am glad you finally accepted that. A week before Christmas, Ryan invited us to dinner at his apartment. He proudly announced that he was cooking everything himself, which immediately made both Mason and me exchange worried glances. You are making that face again, Ryan complained when we arrived carrying dessert. I am an excellent cook. The smoke detector disagrees, Mason answered. Ryan laughed loudly. That happened once. 3 times, I corrected. Details, Ryan replied with dramatic confidence. To everyone's surprise, dinner turned out wonderfully. We spent hours around the small dining table sharing stories from childhood, laughing over old photographs, and teasing Ryan about his legendary inability to keep houseplants alive for more than 2 weeks. At one point, he quietly looked toward both of us and smiled with obvious relief. You know, he said, this is exactly what I hoped would happen. Mason raised an eyebrow. You mean besides your questionable apartment exchange scheme? Ryan nodded without apology. Exactly that. I reached across the table and gently shook my head. It was still ridiculous. Absolutely, Ryan admitted. But sometimes, ridiculous ideas accidentally become the right ones. On our walk home beneath rows of glowing holiday lights, snowflakes began drifting gently through the cold evening air. They settled on Mason's dark coat before melting almost immediately. We walked side by side without rushing, listening to the quiet crunch of snow beneath our boots. As we reached our building, Mason stopped beside the front steps and looked up at the softly illuminated windows of the apartment waiting above us. "Do you remember the first day you arrived?" he asked. I laughed. "You gave me 20 house rules before you even offered me coffee. I offered coffee 8 minutes later. You remember the exact number?" "Of course." I smiled warmly. I remember thinking I had accidentally moved in with the most impossible person in America. Mason chuckled quietly before reaching for my hand. "And now?" he asked. I looked toward the warm light glowing from our balcony where the little birdhouse rested peacefully against the winter sky. "Now," I answered. "I think I accidentally found the place where I was always supposed to be." Mason squeezed my hand gently as we climbed the stairs together, leaving snowy footprints behind us that slowly faded into the evening, while the apartment waiting beyond the door no longer represented a temporary stop in either of our lives. It had quietly become the future we would continue building together, one ordinary day at a time. Spring returned almost without warning. The frost disappeared from the balcony railing. The trees outside our apartment slowly filled with new leaves, and the little birdhouse we had built together echoed with the cheerful chirping of another generation of tiny sparrows. A full year had passed since I first stood outside this apartment, convinced I had been handed the strangest living arrangement imaginable. Looking back now, it was difficult to believe that so much of my life had changed because of one unexpected decision made by someone who thought two lonely people simply needed the chance to share the same roof. The apartment had changed with us. The reading room was now filled with overflowing bookshelves, comfortable chairs, and a large green plant that Mason somehow managed to keep alive despite insisting he was not good with plants. The refrigerator door had become crowded with postcards from weekend trips, handwritten grocery lists, funny sketches Ryan occasionally slipped into our mailbox, and the watercolor bookmark the artist had painted months earlier, now carefully framed instead of hidden inside a novel. Even the famous list of house rules had evolved into something completely different. New notes appeared whenever one of us discovered another small tradition worth keeping. Saturday morning bakery trips. Friday movie nights. Water the birdhouse flowers every Wednesday. Save the last blueberry muffin unless the other person says otherwise. None of those habits had been planned. They had simply become part of our life together. One warm afternoon, Ryan stopped by carrying a cardboard box with a mischievous grin that instantly made both of us suspicious. "Relax," he said before either of us could ask questions. "I am not moving back in." Mason let out an exaggerated sigh of relief. "Good." Ryan laughed as he placed the box on the kitchen table. Inside were old family recipe cards written in their mother's careful handwriting. "I finally finished sorting through the storage unit," he explained. "These belong here." Mason picked up one of the worn recipe cards and quietly traced the faded handwriting with his thumb. His eyes softened, not with sadness this time, but with gratitude. "Thank you," he said. Ryan smiled warmly. She would have loved this place. After Ryan left, we spent the evening making one of the recipes together. It was a simple blueberry cobbler, slightly imperfect because I measured too much cinnamon and Mason forgot to set the kitchen timer after becoming distracted by one of my terrible jokes. We laughed when the topping browned a little more than expected, then carried 2 bowls onto the balcony anyway. The sparrows fluttered from the birdhouse to a nearby branch, singing into the gentle evening air while the city settled into another peaceful sunset. I looked around at the apartment glowing behind us, at the reading room filled with shared memories, at the framed family photograph no longer hidden away, and finally at Mason standing beside me with the same quiet smile that had once been so rare it felt almost impossible. "You know," I said softly, "I used to think home was a place you searched for." Mason looked toward the birdhouse before turning back to me. "And now?" he asked. I smiled as the warm breeze carried the scent of spring through the balcony. "Now I think home is something two people build together, one ordinary day after another, until they suddenly realize they stopped feeling alone a long time ago." Mason reached for my hand with the same quiet certainty that had become our favorite language. There were no dramatic promises, no perfect endings, only the comforting knowledge that tomorrow morning there would be fresh coffee, familiar laughter, another shared breakfast, and another ordinary day waiting just beyond sunrise. Sometimes the happiest stories do not end with extraordinary moments at all. Sometimes they simply continue, filled with kindness, patience, small routines, and the quiet courage to let someone become part of your everyday life. As the first evening stars appeared above the city and the little birdhouse settled into peaceful silence for the night, I realized that the greatest surprise had never been how we met. It was discovering that the life I had never planned became the one I would never choose to leave.